Thank you all very much. So as Ari said, my name is Heather King. I serve as Chief Operating Officer for the Cyber Threat Alliance. Very happy to be with you all today. I'm going to introduce our distinguished panel. I'm joined here by Phil Quaid, who is the Chief Information Security Officer with Fortinet, Vincent Weaver, who serves as Vice President overseeing McAfee Labs, Ryan Gillis, who serves as Vice President of Cybersecurity Strategy and Global Policy for Palo Alto Networks, and Megan Stiefel, who is Cybersecurity Policy Director for Public Knowledge. So I'm very excited to be joined here today talking about this topic. I think this panel has been teed up very well by all the previous speakers today. Obviously, all of you have been involved in, from your various seats, in improving, doing, and frankly, promoting information sharing from your various roles. You've seen what works, what doesn't work all that great, and you've observed some real lessons, I believe. So what I think we'll start off doing is, if you could speak to sort of each of your individual roles, in terms of your views, I guess, on information sharing, the topic in and of itself, your views on each of it.
Hi. First of all, how's the voice? Yes? Thanks, everybody.
I can hear you fine.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi. My name is Phil Quaid. I'm the CISO at Fortinet. But I'd like to talk a little bit about my previous 33 years at the National Security Agency. And so for those who are scared of NSA, don't be. But what it is, it's a really, really good collector of information. And its challenge was, of course, getting that information out to people in a format and a time away, in a format and time that's useful. And it's not just a problem of the intelligence agency, it's a problem of the private sector as well. So many of us, Fortinet's in that camp, we have, I'll call it sensors at millions of places in the world, right? And what I mean is we've sold equipment to millions of people. And that essentially serves as a network that can find information relative to threats and vulnerabilities. And so it's our challenge in the private sector as well to find out the right format and time to put out that information. I'm a fervent believer that one man's detection is another man's prevention, right? So, okay, if it happens to me, bad on me. But if it happens to you, that's partially my responsibility as well. So at Fortinet, we're a founding member of the Cyber Threat Alliance. Are very interested in getting out this information to those who can put it to use so you can prevent as opposed to just detect.
Great. Vincent?
Okay. It's a nice segue because Vincent Weaver, McAfee Labs. So I've lived in the operational security for the last 25 years. And if I kind of cut to the kind of chase and say, you know, what are our opportunities? What are our challenges? It's two things. We're not sharing information fast enough. We're not getting it out to people who need to get it in a timely manner. And we're not sharing the right information. Now, there's some good news in terms of some things are going well. We're kind of turned the corner in terms of how we're thinking about security and risk. But as we get back into, and we'll talk a little bit later in the panel about some of our existing models, they're still not at the level we need to get information out quickly enough. In a world, if you look over the last 2 years, we've seen whole sector attacks against hospitality, healthcare with common vulnerabilities. We've seen this against retail sectors, which says there is clearly a patient 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and again, getting that information out to those sectors where they can actually do something about protect, as well as detect, as well as remediation. So we've got opportunities and challenge, and I think in the panel today we'll talk about some of those and what we recommend.
Hi, Ryan Gillis with Palo Alto Networks. Going third means these guys already took prevention and automation, so I'll add a little bit of context to it. So I think the Cyber Threat Alliance is foundational to enhancing the efforts on an ISAC basis, on an industry basis, as well as to the government. If we as security vendors, and the 6 largest security vendors, I believe, are the founding members, if we are all sharing information in an automated way, so 1, getting to speed, 2, getting to prevention. So we are taking that information that's shared in an automated way, and we're using it towards prevention. And 3, we're doing that with context. So not just sharing individual indicators of compromise, but saying which phase of the attack's life cycle it's part of, which part of the campaign, which part of the playbook this is associated with. If we holistically all have a better understanding of not just these individual indicators of compromise, but the campaigns that are out there. And we are all collectively using that within our respective technologies to prevent against it. That means our entire customer bases are better protected. So we as a company have 42,000 enterprise customers across every sector of industry in 150 countries. If you look at the other companies within the Cyber Threat Alliance, the numbers are staggering across all sectors and government and industry that are using these. So everybody is therefore better protected with information that not just on individual indicators of compromise, but ideally to what Michael and Mark and others were talking about earlier, ideally should be able to make individual campaigns less effective. So that means that the business model of the bad guys, which is to reuse the same things over and over again for high volume, it means that they have to use their intellectual property to develop new campaigns. That's going to slow them down. It's going to make them less effective. It's going to weed out the people that are less sophisticated in the industry, and it's going to let sophisticated criminal actors and nation states that right now use those commonly known playbooks because they're the path of least resistance. They're going to have to use their own indicators of compromise that are really their intellectual property, things that will distinguish them. That's going to make law enforcement and deterrence more effective on the back end. So I think that's a way that industry can be foundational towards sharing and making the government more effective.
So first, I just want to say thanks to CTA and the other sponsors of the event. Thanks for including Public Knowledge as a civil society organization in the conversation. I think it's great that we get to participate, and we are very much appreciative of the opportunity. So obviously, I'm not representing a company, so I can't directly speak to, we're not actively sharing indicators ourselves, but I think it's important to take a moment to reflect on the fact that we do, while most of us in this room are very mature actors, there are still many who are very immature. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is to help with the uptake outside of the Beltway and outside of the security community. And so we'll be continuing to work on that over the next couple of years. But I do want to offer an opportunity to folks who are willing to partner with us in trying to sort of broaden the message and continue the proselytization. We're happy to help.
Thank you all. All right, so let's talk a little bit about information sharing best of breed models. Vincent, I think most folks in this room are probably familiar with the information models that exist. Do you think that there are better models for individual sectors? And is there more of a crawl, walk, run approach that should be considered?
So I think there's a lot we've done well over the last decade or so, setting up some of the ISACs. I mean, we all look at the FS ISAC and others as good examples of collaboration and sharing in trusted communities, or some of the CERT models and being able to distribute it of large volumes of information, or flash advisories, which says we all deal with it, we all recognize it, and that's all good. The challenge when we were looking at that and saying, okay, but what's not working there? Two things. One is, it's still a one-to-many, or it's someone's talking and everyone else is listening. We're not really getting full sharing. We tend to get more a one-way communication out through many of these groups. A big bank talks down to everybody else, here's my information, but the collaboration is not there. The second thing is the speed, which is really we need to do it much faster. And again, some of the groups are very good about getting it out. They've got some platforms. Others, by the time you get it, it's great historical information. It's not very actionable at that moment unless it's a very slow burn attack going on. The third problem is we all discovered IOCs, and I've got a love-hate relationship with IOCs because we flooded ourselves with low-quality, high-volume indicators of compromise, and by and large, many of them are pretty close to useless. So what's happening right now is we're getting more and more flooded with more and more data that's less and less actionable to actually deal with the problem. And I think that's kind of where we started with the CTA going, okay, entity to entity, what can we do to deal with that? Well, it needs to be electronic. We need to do it quickly. It needs to be at volume. It needs to be at scale. Yes, you have to deal with the trust issues and how do you collaborate and work together. And then you got to figure out the right information because like sending out 1 million hashes, it's a waste of time because the one thing we know, it's polymorphic, it's changing, or it's fast flux. So what are the true indicators that I should be looking for? If someone's doing an attack, they park outside the back of the bank, they always go to the upstairs window and they're going to go to the safe. That's kind of what I need to know about that campaign versus, yeah, today he's going to be wearing a blue shirt, but tomorrow he's going to be wearing a red shirt. So I think these are some of the challenges that we're trying to look at and address. And, CTA is entity to entity. There's another aspect of this, which is product to product or solution to solution, interoperability. We've got to get our products talking together. Common messaging bus, common sharing, because if you own these tools, they should collaborate. Mark talked about the marketplace, and that's certainly one part of it. They need to be interoperable to work together, but they also need to be doing information sharing together, because as a gateway, I may know something that the endpoint doesn't. Together, we can make a better decision. So I think these are some of the challenges we're seeing.
That's great. Anyone else have anything that they wanted to add on that?
I agree.
Okay. Ryan, I know you have a unique role, or view rather, having worked on the 2015 cybersecurity information sharing legislation and now obviously in the private sector. In your view, has the ISAL model changed the information sharing environment? What do you see as the challenges and opportunities that exist, both for ISALs and frankly, information sharing in general?
Sure. So I think the legislation was positive in that it gave legal clarity to this positive effort of information sharing. It put into statute things like the Department of Justice and FTC's joint guidelines that cyber threat information sharing did not cause antitrust concerns. So having that in law as opposed to subject to future decisions by executive branch is a positive thing. But if you look at something like the CTA, actually predated the legislation, and it predated actually the executive order as well from President Obama. And so I think the legislation is positive in that it reinforced some of the great practices that were happening. But at the same time, what we really need to focus on now is implementation, sharing, as we've heard before, the speed, the right type of information, those sort of things. And so I think it is also helpful as well that the legislation allows others that may not be like the security vendors in the CTA to understand that they don't need to have just a defined sort of ISACs are very positive, but there are other ways to focus either on a specific problem like botnets, which ISALs were intended to be sort of all-encompassing, or across industry verticals rather than just specific and in sort of stovepipes.
Great. Thank you. Phil, similar to Ryan, you mentioned a bit about your background, and you've had some unique seats, both in government and obviously now in industry as well. What do you see as the lessons we can learn from both government and industry on how best to share intelligence as quickly as possible with each other and then within sectors and within an organization in and of itself?
Got it. So if I could, I'd like you guys to imagine a visual. On one end, there's a fish. On the other end is a human being. And I'm going to step through the evolution from fish to human being. If you prefer, you can do 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. But where we are today is at information sharing 1.0. We're a fish. And we're talking about how we need to get better at swimming fast and stuff like that. But we've got a long way to evolve because we don't aspire just to be a fish as a community of information sharers. We aspire to be human. So next level up, what is it? You've got the salamander, right? The fish with some legs. What that is, I believe, it's not just sharing indicators of compromise, but as someone else said earlier, perhaps context or perhaps how to mitigate behaviors, not just indicators of fixed-based signatures. Next up the evolutionary chain, let's call it a furry animal or maybe even a monkey. We need to figure out how the right formats to share the actual mitigations, not just an indicator of compromise, but how do we actually go about stopping that from happening again. Next up the evolutionary chain, I think we need to think about how do we abstract those mitigations so that they're applicable no matter what our architecture or configuration is, right? Because if you're using Palo Alto and I'm using Fortinet, we still need to be able to figure out how to act on those mitigations very quickly. And getting pretty close to that human level part of the evolutionary chain, we need those things to be automatically ingested, right? We can't simply keep sharing via email or at near cyber relevant speed. We need to share at cyber relevant speed so those indicators and those mitigations are automatically ingested. And if you don't mind me going one step further beyond simply the human at the end of that evolutionary chain, we need to have a automation. So think of a robot under the control of a human, remote control of a human. We need to have those things, those indicators automatically ingested and automatically acted upon so they can address the speed and scale that these compromisers are coming at us. So I'm not talking about Skynet, where the robots are getting outside our control. What I'm talking about is leveraging automation so that we can automatically ingest these mitigations and then get them to work at speed and scale. So it's a long way of saying it's cool that we're talking about the fish and maybe the salamanders today, but it's on us as a community to be getting ready for the chimpanzee, the humans, and the robot definitions of information sharing, so that 2 years from now we're not talking about the fish and salamanders again.
Thanks, Phil. I'm going to have to take that analogy home with me. My husband will appreciate that. So, Megan, I was also really excited about your joining this panel. I know we've talked in the past that not everybody believes in sharing information with others. And in fact, I think when we talked, I was a little bit taken back that that notion still might exist. What do you see as the key issues that enable this thinking? And how do we continue to push forward with protecting information and, frankly, unlocking it as well?
Sure. So just to sort of echo what I was saying earlier, I think all of us in this room and many of us in the city are pretty mature actors in this space. But as we heard some of the prior panelists talk about, while there is significant uptake on the risks around cybersecurity at the enterprise and board level of large corporations, there is still a big risk of small and medium-sized businesses. And so there, I think these stakeholders may not be as mature as many of us and may not be able to even know where to go to get the right answers. So I think, there is still, we can't sort of lose sight of the small fish or the sort of embryonic actors in this space who, as we all know, can ultimately be a significant risk for all of us. So I think there's an important, ask that I have for folks on the panel and those in the room is to continue to talk about the value, the business proposition, the business value out of information sharing. So to the extent that we, as a community, can talk about at a level that it does not give away TTPs or proprietary information on the way different security vendors' products operate, but to the extent that we were able to say information sharing really helped us solve this issue. Of course, we all know that sort of at a high level, but to the extent that we were able to say we were able to partner with whomever to take down or mitigate a significant risk, I think that will help not only the build sort of a greater demand from small or medium-sized businesses to know to ask the right questions, but also to consider thinking about, I just lost my train of thought, it's essentially, it drives greater demand for information sharing in a way that those who may not be involved in the conversation will then begin to think, actually, this is worth my taking the time to invest in, to learn, to join the conversation, figure out the right terms. And I think, part of the benefit, stating the obvious, of the six and taxi approach is that for those people or for those actors who may not be as mature, including some in civil society who may sort of not be as familiar with what cybersecurity and CTI sharing of cyber threat indicators is, the taxonomy builds trust because we understand if you're talking about a set of 100 fields, we know that what's going in those fields, which while not everybody in civil society may be able to pick up the six taxi protocol and understand exactly what it means, there's a means to have a conversation around, and we're all speaking the same language. So I think I would urge you all to be proponents of the success of information sharing and talk more about it.
Thank you. So are there specific short-term actions or recommendations you all would offer? And going back to your point, Megan, is this sort of more about, to your point about trust, expanding the circle of trust? And obviously that happens over time. So
I'll jump in. So to Megan's point, I think that if we're going to really get to a big leap forward nationally, we need to create greater trust, of course, between those who might be sharing or collaborating. So I'm talking about the public and private sector. So you look at critical infrastructure today. We all know it's owned and operated primarily by the private sector. We all know that no one entity is in charge of the infrastructure or infrastructures. But we also know that when those infrastructures come under serious attack by large foreign countries, the solution set's going to be some combination of the public sector and the private sector, ultimately doing the highest end defense of them. Well, how are we going to get from here, where we are today, where there's a degree of mistrust between the public and private sector, to the point where we're working side by side? defending infrastructures. I think to Megan's point, it starts with building trust. And the best way to start building trust in muscle memory is by, guess what, information sharing, right? It's the least threatening way of collaboration. You share information about what you've seen, how you protect yourself. People perceive that as being valuable. Next thing you know, maybe you're doing some joint pilots together and you're practicing, you're experimenting with some technologies, or you're figuring out how you might do a joint exercise so that you know how to work together better during crisis. But it all starts with information sharing and building trust to Megan's point.
And to build upon that, if I'm not sure how many people know the journey of the CTA, but that's exactly where we started as entities sitting around the table going, what do we do? How do we do it? And that building the muscle memory was a key part of it. So the first thing was do something simple that gets you in the mood. Share fresh samples, not very exciting, but get some muscle memory, get the infrastructure, get the platform in place. And then started to build upon it. We took a exercise around ransomware. It's in your face. It should be obvious. But the whole goal was to try and exercise what are you learning, what are you seeing, what are you taking away from that exercise, and then go to the next level, which for us, campaign intelligence and risk modeling. But that notion is, I agree. If you think you're going to do it on the day of WannaCry, ain't going to happen. When you look back at WannaCry, what did half the industry do? They all scraped off blogs, off websites to get information, to bring back, put into products and do things in. So again, as a institutional information sharing there, it's not there yet.
Yeah, and I think it's important as well to talk through the evolution of what the CTA shares. So initially, the barrier to entry was not a fee that you would pay, but it was 1,000 unique pieces of malware a day. So it was based exclusively on quantity. It had to be zero-day stuff checked against virus total to make sure that it wasn't things that people have known about forever. But so that was great to build, as you've said, the muscle memory, but it wasn't getting at enough of the attack into the campaign. So now the way that it's scored is quantity and quality. And so your submission goes in and you identify all these different aspects about it. So is it part of delivery? Is it part of command and control? Is it associated with these known campaigns? All of those things, it combines both the automation of sharing and context. And if you look at some of the government programs, I think we are now still in sort of the earlier phases of just trying to build based on quantity rather than context combined into that automated sharing. So I think, again, the near-term action here is we know what we're supposed to be doing and we need to be implementing it at speed and focused on quantity and quality.
Megan, do you have anything else you'd like to offer?
So just sort of to piggyback off of what all of these folks have said and something Mark mentioned in his remarks, I was happy to hear the idea that companies are beginning to think about putting in RFPs, the request or obligation for entities to participate in some sort of information sharing organization. I think, among other things, that again raises the level of transparency and trust to the extent that, may be unlikely that an organization that's putting forward an RFP would not be part of an information sharing ecosystem, but it likely probably is happening. And so I think, again, to the extent that we can build transparency and trust around this idea that information sharing, as we all know, is not a silver bullet, but it is one tool in the toolbox that we really need everyone to participate in. And to the extent that we can sort of make that, and I think many people, I was talking with some colleagues in the financial services sector the other day who said information sharing is the norm. And as we've talked, I don't think that that's the case, again, among the, not to belabor the point, but among the small and medium-sized businesses, those who are not mature enterprises, they need a place to begin. And thankfully, we have the Cyber Threat Alliance, and hopefully this will be the trickle-down effect of bringing more into the ecosystem.
Thank you. So kind of getting to the consumption side of things, do you think that there are ways to make ingesting information easier?
I'm personally worried about the architectures that we have today, not the sharing architectures, but more about the defensive strategies that we're using today. So 10, 15 years ago, the state-of-the-art defensive strategy was draw a boundary around your network and actively defend it. Michael worked with you on NCI and some other things to make that strategy a reality for several places. But the boundary is, I don't want to say dead, but the boundary is disappearing, right? We don't have these boundaries where there's single entry points on our network. Mobility, wireless, and the cloud have made most of our networks boundaryless. So what that means is that the delivery architecture and even the indicators themselves can no longer simply be things that you would mitigate at the boundary, or you can only transmit to just a few places and expect them to act. our defensive architectures have to be built on, I believe, what I call agile segmentation. So micro and macro segmentation at lots of different places in the network. Those are the new boundaries. So what that means, though, is that as we're creating indicators, in doing so in context and sending out mitigations, those things need to be able to be acted upon at multiple places of the architecture, not just the boundary anymore. Because, and I wish I was on the IoT panel, because we were somewhat lamenting, the panel somewhat lamenting that it's really, really difficult to secure IoT, and it is, because they're headless, they're dumb, they're not well authenticated. However, maybe we ought to stop thinking about only mitigating at the point of vulnerability. Maybe we ought to start talking about mitigate at your place of strength. So if you truly do have an architecture with multiple places to mitigate, then we can send out an indicator or a mitigation and choose the right time and place to implement that mitigation. And it might not be at the place of IoT access at all. It might be at some other point of our architecture. So it's a long way of saying that not only do we get better at information sharing, as we've described as a panel and elsewhere, but we also need to make sure that we're accommodating the new architectures that are emerging on which defenses will be built, and that is a borderless network.
I think if you look at the way that we use digital technology right now to sort of build on some of the stuff that Mark talked about earlier, if you want to go to CNN.com, you put it in and it works and you don't have to think about it. If you look at the way that the cybersecurity community has grown up, it is discrete technologies to solve discrete problems, and people then have to integrate those. So you're against an increasingly automated adversary. Vincent talked about polymorphic malware, and increasingly the bad guys are using automation, and we are continuing to put things in the security stack that then people on the back end have to integrate. And so there are initial steps right now that are being taken, like the leveraging of Stix and Taxi, using APIs, so the technology from different vendors, from different parts of the enforcement points within the kill chain can work together. But again, we're really sort of in the incrementalism stage. And so what we need to get to is security by default that leverages automation for the good guys, not just allowing the bad guys to take advantage of automation. So that's, as Mark talks about the moonshot idea, how do we ensure that there's an ecosystem of defense so that security is the default posture, so that you don't have to know so much about how to architect your network and make changes that are customized to you, so that you just get to a somewhat manageable risk. And right now, the onus is far too much on the user to be able to integrate all of these things, rather than plug and play and assume things are safe and then focus your people on discrete or sophisticated attacks. So,
yeah, to build upon that, I mean, I think currently the SOC, or the Security Operations Center, they're going through a revolution. They're getting their own value of sort of changing how we used to look at their SIM, SOC technology into, we got to embrace the use of analytics and machine learning. But frankly, we're still at the fish stage today, which says, you look at most SOCs today, they're overloaded with events. Legitimate events are coming into them. In some cases, up to millions of events coming in per day that are real entry security events. They put an enormous amount of effort to try and put that funnel down, get their smart guys in the room, 25, 30 people on the tie end, to try and understand them, to figure out, of these things, which one am I putting my time and attention to? At the end of all that process, if they're successful, they're sending out a series of help desk tickets to somebody in the IT organization to go change a firewall or do something else, going, that's not going to scale. So again, the ability to be able to recognize with context around which of these events, what's the scope of the event, what is it telling me, is one part of it, and that's the SOC revolution. And the second part is the orchestration revolution. And we've all talked about the ability to send it out to products, consume it automatically in a safe way, is absolutely going to be critical to this whole thing working together.
So what does information sharing look like in the OT SCADA environment? I know we've talked a little bit about this in preparation for this panel today.
I'll start with that, if you don't mind. As we all know, the OT environment, operational technology, is the type of technologies that used in some of the critical infrastructures, oil and gas, electricity, critical manufacturing, stuff like that. And they are different technologies, different protocols, different culture. So if you go to any of the conferences, it's typically an IT conference or an OT conference. We literally joked at one of those OT conferences that the ISAC, its name was a beer ISAC. meaning that's how you got together, shared information with your peers. You'd have a beer and you talked about the different threats and vulnerabilities you're seeing.
It works.
And it works. It's a relatively closed community of very, very strongly professional people who've been working this for decades. And so I'll say that just the collective we that are birthed in the IT community, we need to make sure that we're talking the language of the OT community and acknowledge that they have different protocols, different architectures, different cultures, and quite honestly, different security policies. As someone mentioned earlier, it's not about confidentiality in these critical infrastructures. It's about safety and reliability. So we need to make sure that we're developing indicators and sharing the right types of information and mitigations that are primarily about, guess what, safety and reliability, not just confidentiality assets. So I think we need to, in the OT environment, I think we need to flip our thinking around and figure out what type of information, actionable information can be shared for that OT environment so they can act on it for safety and reliability reasons. Different paradigm.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, and just sort of the basics, right, which is that in that different operating environment, obviously there's no Patch Tuesday in the electric industry. You know, there's a very different, you don't just shut down the grid at 2 a.m. Every Tuesday. And so the security solutions that need to be tailored to that industry need to recognize those realities and need to recognize that they're probably running out of date and not fully patched software. And that needs to be focused, I think, like Phil was saying earlier in some of the IoT approaches, on points of strength. So can you focus on exploits at the endpoint rather than malware, which can leverage the lack of updates? Can you, in some places within the network, whether it's in the intranet or internet, are there points with which you can apply network security that where endpoint and typical patching in an IT environment would be able to adjust? So that is all a precursor to IoT, right? Because the OT problem was 10 years ago and the IoT problem started several years ago. And so those similar issues are just the expansion of that same environment now to your smart refrigerator, and for some reason your phone needs to tell you when your toast is ready and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and kind of build upon, there's clearly a kind of a segmentation approach which says, look, if I can't secure it, can I at least watch the network traffic? Can I make some decisions around that, play to your strength? There's technologies that are available today that actually play better in that area, like application control. Don't allow anything that's not trusted to even run in that environment. Why am I putting a generic AV scanner on a system? Because I shouldn't be running stuff that's not allowed, not trusted. So there's things we can do that can put these controls around it. They're not that complicated. I fully agree protocols, particularly in the power and energy space, are different. You need to understand them. You need to speak the language, because otherwise you don't know the context around what's going there. I may notice something malicious, but I really don't know the context unless I speak that protocol. And that's about enabling our technology to speak those languages.
Okay, so another sort of question that's a little bit more provocative. Do you think voluntary information sharing with the government works or is working?
Yes, but not at the speed and scope and scale that is necessary. So again, AIS is a good step, but it doesn't have any context. The context from DHS comes through things like CISP. Sometimes that's going to be necessary. So in WannaCry, some technologies had a fix, but it was necessary for all of us to be on the phone at midnight that Friday when WannaCry broke, and the CTA contributed things to the government's analysis and what CERT pushed out. For example, the initial reporting was that email was the way that was the vector through which WannaCry was being spread. None of the vendors in the CTA or anybody else on the call had seen that. And so Michael was actually interfacing with DHS on those twice-a-day calls. And we helped DHS get more accurate information out about those things, as well as Phil was saying, not just about the infection vectors, not just about the IOCs, but about the preventative measures that worked. And so some of these things can't always be automated, right? But and having government to have a playbook that they can roll off the shelf and immediately convene those types of things so that, we leverage that experience just like we do in the disaster response area into this. It is necessary, and the government is always going to be a great place to convene cross-sector and bring together public and private knowledge. So I think good, but far too slow still.
Yeah, and I think just building on WannaCry, I'd say it's as simple as this, which is having the email guys on the call to say, we're not seeing it, it's not propagating that way, it was powerful because it stopped the whole industry chasing down this rabbit hole into, no, let's focus on what we actually do and don't know over here. So again, was it that complicated? Was it sort of earth-shattering? Was it private? None of it. It was simply basic information that allowed us to redirect our efforts back into something that we actually did care about. And it can work. So it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be something. It just needs to be actionable.
So pardon me if I'm too cute with the answer. I'll pass on the does it work or not, because these guys offered some opinions. But back to one of my earlier points, we're not being aspirational enough. If we're simply saying, does it work, as defined as, are we sharing enough indicators? Okay, you could argue that it works good enough. But we need to raise the bar. We need to get to the salamander and chimpanzees and stuff like that. We need to be sharing mitigations in context so that they are actionable as quickly as possible. We need to raise the bar for what works means.
Megan, did you have anything else you wanted to add there?
I think it's just, to Mark's comments earlier about how are we going to make can we set the goal as making the internet safer in 10 years? We need to do a better job of, I think, talking about it. So, again, mature actors are talking about context. And so, maybe we need to think about, are there any, is there enough space for context to come into the conversation, or do people feel like there are potential limitations? And if there are, let's have a conversation about that and figure out the way we can make it more machine speed context sharing.
Okay, so I think what we'll do is now we're going to kind of open it up and see what questions you all have. So, and if you have questions, if you can go to either of the mics, that would be great.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Arabella from Arbor Networks. I had a question, maybe it's too market-centric, but I'll ask it anyway. So I think the threat intelligence market is not the biggest cybersecurity market, but it's probably 300, 400 million. Many of you are on the panel, involved in companies that make money somehow from threat intelligence. When you talk about sharing information, obviously, a lot of vendors share information anyway, from a research perspective. But I just had a question, I guess, for any panelist around how do you deal with some of that tension between making money as a business potentially by keeping threat intelligence to yourselves and sharing?
So I'll go back to something Mark said at the beginning, which says that intelligence or information has to be the oxygen that drives our business. We can differentiate based on our better control points or technologies, where we're located. Do we have a better user experience? Is it more manageable? There's tons of areas we can still compete. But the oxygen, the fuel that drives everything we do, is intelligence. Now, as an industry, we used to share things like malware samples, but then you had to process it all yourself, and you get through that, and you update the information. Not fast enough, not good enough. You have a lot of people out there sharing very raw information like, hey, all this information's on the dark web, go figure out what to do with us. So again, it's not very actionable in terms of, so what do I do with us? So I think that's a challenge we're going back out to the industry and saying, this can't be the thing we're fighting over, because guess what? None of us have it. We all have a portion of it, whether I'm missing an industry sector one, or I'm missing a region because I happen to be in a different region. But you do, or he does, or they do. So if we can combine that information, we will get to a better answer faster, and then compete on our control points or better areas for us. It's hard, because if you're making money off that today, it's hard to give it up. And there's a lot of small people who are specialized in this space who'd say, look, we really are the world's better. And we'll go, well, not really, because if we were, we'd be solving this problem. So again, I think it's just a challenge that says this is not the thing to compete upon. There's tons of other areas you can be much more differentiated on.
And we've made a business decision as a company, too, to invest in threat intelligence, but not as a product or anything for sale. So our threat intelligence team, our fearless leader here, Rick Howard, is intended to publish reports on things that we find, either on things that we are seeing across customer networks, across our own networks, or things that are seen in the wild, and push that information out to make the ecosystem stronger. So we'll protect our customers against it. And so we have made a choice not to make that part of the business model. I think increasingly you are going to see niche players that have unique intelligence, like on some of the black market stuff and those sort of things. That kind of research, especially if you're a bank and you want to know if your customer information is out there, but that gets away from the cyber, more cyber-enabled crime. And I think increasingly those companies that have predicated their business model just on having indicators of compromise and threat intelligence, I think they're going to increasingly see a loss in market share when there's better information flowing across the largest security vendors.
Yeah, no, that's a great, thank you very much for answering it so candidly. Just a quick follow-up question, and by the way, I kind of agree with the panelists in general, like threat intelligence is really, has to be part of the wider platform protection most companies offer. As you've sort of worked together on the Cyber Threat Alliance, could you sort of maybe just talk to an example of how you really learned something by collaborating? I mean, as we mentioned, a lot of research teams already collaborate, but oftentimes they're still doing a lot of the, the reverse engineering, the sort of the hard work, manual work themselves. I was just wondering if you could talk about what you've learned. You don't have to go into gory detail, but anything that you learned by working together.
I'll offer a couple. Maybe one of our companies is especially good at characterizing threat that happens at the endpoint. Someone else is really good at characterizing something that happens at the edge or midpoint or something like that. And further, maybe another company's seeing a whole lot of stuff in one sector that another company doesn't specialize in. So, we each have some unique perspectives and postures. And when you bring those things together, you can get a better, someone mentioned earlier, you get better context of where this particular threat vector is coming from. So I think that's the strength. It's strength and diversity.
Yeah, the report we did on CryptoWall 3, which was a ransomware campaign I think Vincent was alluding to earlier, several years ago, brought together the vendors of the CTA. We shared what we knew about this one particular ransomware campaign, had extorted over $300 million in ransomware payments in under a year. Again, if you just think of this from a business model perspective, to understand the volume, those payments are usually 20 grand or less by a company and 300 to 500 by an individual. So that's a staggering volume to get to over $300 million in under a year. We shared what we knew about the infrastructure of that campaign. I think we identified amongst the vendors 839 command and control nodes. All of our customers were collectively protected against that infrastructure. We shared that with DHS and the FBI as we were getting ready to go public with that. DHS used that to protect U.S. government networks. FBI furthered their criminal investigation. It took a little while, so this gets to the earlier question about is the speed and scope and scale working. It took a while, but we got an additional 150 command and control nodes that were associated with that campaign and infrastructure that the vendors may or may not have known about in isolation, but we didn't know it was part of that campaign. So our data set was enriched by what was shared by the U.S. government. And at the outcome was, the day after we published that report, the attackers went to CryptoWall 4. The infrastructure wasn't ready for prime time, and they ultimately abandoned it in a relatively short amount of time. So we don't think those guys reformed and went out and worked for legitimate businesses, but we think we made the bad guys use their IP and develop new infrastructure. And that's, again, to get back to Mark's point, that's where you start to get leverage, is if you bump those guys off the infrastructure that they're reusing just for high volume.
I'll give you a slightly different version of that, which is we also learned something really valuable. An enormous amount of what we think is unique to us actually isn't that unique. 80% of what we're finding was the same things coming up. So we found, hey, collectively, we're spending an enormous amount of time coming up with this insight that we think is unique that actually really wasn't that unique. The nuggets at the edges in terms of, is it actionable, is it there, hey, what's that control point, what's a CNC, actually that was really valuable, but that was the nuggets inside the information. So again, a lesson for the industry is we're spending an enormous amount of time and energy and money in reprocessing the same information. And so when it comes to what can we do better, actually, if you free up that capacity, you can spend more time in looking at unique aspects. And that was one of those aha moments going, oh, we should have thought of that. We didn't, but now we learned. Yeah.
Other questions? Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I just wanted to personally thank each of you for participating on this panel, and thank you all, too, for the good questions.